The lights above the corridor flickered and died, then came back in a sickly orange glow that made everything look like it was burning from the inside out. Cyrillith pressed her daughter tighter against her chest and kept moving, her clawed feet scraping against floor panels that had buckled from the explosions hours earlier. Iari was 6 years old and weighed almost nothing, but the weight of carrying her through the ruined hallways of Vayrith Station made Cyrillith feel like she was dragging the whole world behind her. The little dragon girl had her face buried in her mother's neck, and her small arms wrapped around as far as they could reach, and her left wing hung at a bad angle, splinted with a strip of torn curtain fabric from their quarters that no longer existed. Cyrillith had watched through a viewport as veteran soldiers forced their way into the residential ring, and began clearing families out, room by room, smashing whatever they found. Draelkin did not carry fast enough. She had grabbed Iari, and nothing else. Around them, the station groaned and shuddered like a living thing in pain. Vayrith had been home to nearly 4,000 Draelkin families for 3 generations, built around an ancient Aetherium core that hummed with energy older than most civilizations in the galaxy. The Draelkin had tended that core, and built their lives around its warmth, raised their children in its gentle glow, sung their songs in halls that resonated with its pulse. And now, the Galactic Sovereignty Council had decided that the Aetherium core was too valuable to be left in the care of a minor species. That was the word they used, minor. As if the Draelkin were children who had been playing with something dangerous, and needed it taken away by responsible adults. The truth was simpler and uglier than any legal language could hide. The Council wanted the core, and the Draelkin were not powerful enough to stop them. Cyrillith turned a corner and nearly walked into a wall of Draelkin bodies. The corridor opened into a massive cargo hangar, and it was already packed with hundreds of her people. They sat on the cold metal floor in clusters, families huddled together, elders propped against shipping containers, children crying in that high, keening way that Draelkin young do when they are frightened and cold. The temperature in the hangar was dropping. Draelkin were warm-blooded, but their bodies needed external heat to regulate properly, and the environmental systems in this section of the station had been shut down. Whether by damage or by design, Cyrillith could not tell. She found a space near the far wall between a stack of cargo crates and a broken loading arm, and she lowered herself to the ground, with Iari still clinging to her. The little girl finally pulled her face away from her mother's neck and looked around with those enormous amber eyes that all Draelkin children had. "Mama, why is everyone sitting on the floor?" Iari asked. "Because we are waiting, little flame," Cyrillith said. "Waiting for what?" Cyrillith did not have an answer. Across the hangar, veteran soldiers stood in rigid formations at every entrance. They were tall insectoid creatures with black chitinous armor that seemed to grow from their own bodies, and they held pulse rifles with the casual ease of beings who had never once questioned whether they had the right to point weapons at unarmed families. Cyrillith thought about Korath. Her mate had been in the lower engineering levels when the Council ships arrived. He had sent her one message through the station's internal network before the communication array went dark. Just 3 words. "Take Iari and run." She had run, and now she sat on a freezing hangar floor, and did not know if Korath was alive or dead. Not cry, because Iari was watching her face the way children do when they are trying to figure out if they should be scared. So Cyrillith held her expression steady and stroked Iari's hair, and told her everything would be fine. Hours passed. A Draelkin elder named Vostein moved through the crowd, passing along what information he had gathered. The Council had declared Vayrith Station a reclaimed territorial asset, and all Draelkin residents were to be relocated to Marin's Drift, a barren moon in a dead system with no infrastructure, no resources, and no breathable atmosphere without sealed habitats that nobody was offering to build. For the elderly and the very young, Marin's drift was a death sentence wrapped in legal language. Vostein said this quietly to the adults, making sure the children could not hear. But Cyrillith heard, and the weight of it settled on her like stone. Draelkin were proud beings, descended from sky hunters who had once ridden solar winds between stars. Their scales shimmered in shades of sapphire and emerald and gold, and their wings could carry them through atmospheres that would crush lesser species. But here in this cold metal room, they looked small. They looked defeated. And Cyrillith, who had held herself together through the explosions and the soldiers and the running and the not knowing, finally broke. She pulled Iari close and pressed her face into her daughter's hair, and she wept. She tried to keep it silent, but her shoulders shook, and her breath hitched in ragged gasps, and the tears that ran down her scaled cheeks were hot enough to steam in the freezing air. Iari felt her mother's body trembling, and looked up. "Mama," she whispered. "I am fine, little flame," Cyrillith lied. "You are crying." "No, I am just cold." Iari was 6, not stupid, but she accepted the moment. Lie the way children do when they love their parents too much to argue. Instead, she looked out across the hangar with those big amber eyes, searching for something, anything that might help. And she found it. Near the far entrance, past the rows of veteran soldiers, a lone figure in a grease-stained jumpsuit was arguing with a veteran officer. The figure was short compared to the insectoid soldiers, with no wings and no scales and no claws, soft pink skin and dark hair, and a face that was turning red with anger as he jabbed a finger at the officer's chest. A human. Iari tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama," she said. "What is it, Iari?" "Don't cry, Mama," the little girl said, and she pointed one small clawed finger across the hangar toward the human in the dirty jumpsuit. "Maybe that human will assist us." Cyrillith looked where her daughter was pointing and saw the human get shoved backward by the veteran officer, stumbled and caught himself against a wall panel, and for just a moment he looked across the hangar, and his eyes met the gaze of a tiny dragon girl who was waving at him from between 2 cargo crates. Something in the human's face changed. The anger did not leave, but it shifted into something harder and quieter and far more dangerous. The kind of expression that comes over a person who has just made a decision they will not walk back from, no matter what it costs them. Sergeant Joel Marin straightened his jumpsuit, wiped the blood from his lip where the veteran had split it, and turned back toward the maintenance corridor he had come from. Joel Marin was not a soldier, and he was not a hero, and he was not any of the things that people in stories are supposed to be when terrible things happen around them. He was 34 years old, and he had grown up on Brannock's Reach, a human colony world where the main industries were dirt farming and trying not to get eaten by the local wildlife. He had joined a technical training program at 18 because it meant he could leave Brannock's Reach, and he had spent the next 16 years fixing things on stations and ships across the galaxy because fixing things was the one skill he had that nobody could argue with. A broken air recycler did not care about your species or your politics or your opinions about territorial law. It just needed someone to find the bad valve and replace it. Joel had taken the Varith station contract 2 years ago for the pay, which was decent, and for the location, which was quiet. Neighbors. They were large and sometimes intimidating with their wings and their fire glands and their teeth, but they were also unfailingly polite and deeply curious about humans, who they considered fascinating in the way that a person might find a small, clever animal fascinating. Joel did not mind being found fascinating. He had fixed their heating systems and patched their water recyclers and rewired their nursery lighting when the old circuits started to fail. In return, they had fed him at their tables and taught him 3 words in Dralkin, and generally treated him like a slightly odd family pet who was very good with tools. Iari had drawn him a picture once. It showed a tall figure with flat teeth and no wings, standing next to a much smaller figure with enormous wings and what appeared to be fire coming out of her mouth. Underneath it she had written in shaky trade common letters, "My human." Joel still had that picture, taped to the end, inside of his toolkit. He thought about it now as he moved through the maintenance sub-level corridors that ran beneath the station like veins under skin. These corridors were his kingdom. He had spent 2 years mapping every junction and every bypass and every manual override point in the environmental system, and he knew them the way a musician knows the strings of an instrument. The veteran soldiers above did not know these corridors existed, or if they did not care about them, because the corridors were cramped and dirty and beneath the dignity of a conquering force. That was their first mistake. Joel reached Junction 7 Alpha and pulled open an access panel with his wrench. The environmental controls for the cargo hangar ran through this junction, and someone had shut them down from the main command terminal on the operations deck. But the main command terminal was not the only way to control the heating. Manual bypass on this junction 6 months ago, when the automated system had glitched during a cold snap, and he had needed to get heat to the residential ring fast, without waiting for the software to catch up. He had never removed the bypass because he was lazy about paperwork, and removing it would have meant filing a modification report with the station management office. Sometimes, laziness saves lives. He flipped the bypass switches and rerouted heating from the officer quarters on Deck 3 down through the sub-level conduits and up into the cargo hangar floor vents. It would take about 20 minutes for the temperature to start climbing, but within an hour, the hangar would be warm enough to keep the Draelkin from going hypothermic. Next, he moved to a food storage unit on sub-level 2 that was locked with a standard council security code. Joel did not know the code, but he did know that the electronic lock drew power from a junction box that he could reach through a ceiling panel, and if that junction box happened to suffer a sudden and mysterious disconnection, then the lock would default to its fail-safe open position. The junction box suffered a sudden and mysterious disconnection. Joel propped open the food storage unit and marked the route from the cargo hangar access point with small scratches on the wall panels that a Draelkin would recognize as trail markers, but a veteran would walk right past. Then he went to work on the hard part. Veyrit Station's main communication array had been destroyed during the initial assault, but the station had a backup relay in the maintenance sublevel that was designed for emergency distress signals. It was old and weak, and its range was limited, but it could broadcast on human emergency frequencies, and human emergency frequencies were monitored by every human vessel within a dozen light years. Joel sat down in front of the relay terminal and thought about what to. He was not good with words. He was good with wrenches and wire cutters and diagnostic scanners. But the words came anyway, rough and simple and honest, the way words tend to be when a person does not have time to make them pretty. He pressed the broadcast button and spoke. "This is Sergeant Joel Marin, human contractor, Veyrit Station, broadcasting on United Nations Emergency Frequency 774. The Galactic Sovereignty Council has seized this station and is forcibly relocating all Draelkin civilian residents. There are approximately 4,000 Draelkin here, including elderly and children. Children are injured. They have no legal advocate, no medical supplies, and no one coming for them. I am one man with a wrench. I need more wrenches. Marin out." He set the relay to repeat the message on a loop every 3 minutes, and then he sat back and stared at the ceiling and wondered if anyone out there was listening. There was listening. A sound made him look down. Through a ventilation grate near the floor, 2 amber eyes were staring up at him. "Hello," whispered Iari. Joel blinked and then crouched down beside the grate. "Hey kid," he said quietly. "How did you find me down here?" "I followed the worm," Iari said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. The floor got warm, and I followed where the warmth was coming from, and I found this grate, and I can see you through it. You should be with your mama. Mama is sleeping, she cried until she fell asleep, and I didn't want to wake her. Was it you who made it warm? Joel paused, and then nodded. Yes, I knew it, Yari said with a fierce little whisper of triumph. I told Mama you would assist us, and you did. Can you fix my wing too? Joel looked at the small splinted wing, visible through the grate slats, and felt something twist in his chest. I will try. Good, Yari said. I will come back and check on you later, because you are alone down here, and that is not safe. And then she was gone, padding away on silent little clawed feet back toward the ventilation shaft. Joel shook his head and turned back to his work, but he was smiling for the first time in 12 hours. He fashioned a food ration package small enough to fit through the grate slats and tucked it through with a note written in the worst Dralkin script the language had ever suffered. The note said, I see you, and you are not alone. He did not know if Cyrillith would find it, but she did. Hours later, when Cyrillith woke and found Iari sitting beside her with a food ration and a crumpled note, she read the words and pressed the paper against her chest and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the walls of the station, a human she had never spoken to was fighting for her family with nothing but maintenance access codes and a stubborn resolve. Refusal to look away. And somewhere in deep space, a battered human frigate called the Resolute Ember was picking up a repeating distress signal. Captain Dahlia Voss played the message for her bridge crew, and the bridge went silent. Then Voss leaned forward and said 2 words. Set course. The Resolute Ember turned toward Vayrith Station and burned hard into the dark. They found him in the maintenance corridors just before dawn cycle. 4 veteran soldiers with pulse rifles cornered Joel at Junction 12 Beta, where the sublevel narrowed to a single passage, and he had nowhere to run and nothing to fight with except a wrench that suddenly felt very small in his hand. Sub-Prefect Chilik was waiting for him in the operations room. The veteran commander sat behind a command desk that had belonged to the Dralkin station chief until 12 hours ago, and his compound eyes studied Joel the way a scientist might study a specimen that was behaving outside expected parameters. You are the human technician, Chilik said. Sergeant Joel Marin, Environmental Systems, Joel replied. You rerouted the heating to the cargo bay. Yes, Joel said. You disabled the lock on the food storage unit. Guilty. You are broadcasting a distress signal on human frequencies. Joel said nothing to that one, because he figured it was probably not smart to confirm the thing that would make them the angriest. Chilik tilted his head in that clicking insectoid way that meant he was processing something confusing. I do not understand, the sub-prefect said, and the strange thing was that he sounded genuine about it. You are a contracted maintenance worker. Your species has no treaty obligations to the Dralkin. You have no military authority, no diplomatic standing, and no personal connection to these creatures beyond a labor assignment that has now been terminated. He leaned forward. Why would you risk your contract, your safety, and your future for a species that is not your own? Joel looked at him. Because someone should, he said. Chilik stared at Joel for a long time, with those black compound eyes that reflected nothing and revealed nothing. Fascinating, he said finally, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but. Your species has always been peculiar. You are young and soft, and you lack natural weapons of any kind. And yet you consistently involve yourselves in affairs that do not concern you. It is as if you are biologically incapable of minding your own business. Yeah, Joel said, we get that a lot. Chilik ordered Joel stripped of his toolkit and his access credentials, and thrown into the cargo bay with the Dralkin refugees. It was meant as a punishment and a humiliation. It was the second mistake the veteran made that day. when the soldiers shoved Joel through the cargo bay doors, and he stumbled onto the cold floor among the huddled Drailkin families. The entire hangar went quiet. 4,000 pairs of eyes turned to look at the small wingless creature who had just been thrown in among them. And there was a moment of absolute stillness. Then, Ayari's voice rang out across the silence, like a bell. "That is my human," she shouted, and she broke free from Cyrillith's grip and ran across the hangar floor on her little clawed feet and slammed into Joel's legs with enough force to nearly knock him down. Joel caught himself and looked down at the dragon girl who had attached herself to his knees like a barnacle with scales. "Hey kid," he said. "They took your tools," Ayari said, staring at his empty belt with outrage. "They did. That is very rude." "It really is." Cyrillith approached slowly, and behind her the Drailkin parted to let her through in a way that told Joel she had become someone important in the hours since the crisis began. She stopped in front of Joel and looked at him with those deep golden eyes that all adult Drailkin had, and for a long moment she just studied his face. "You are the one who made it warm," she said in careful trade common. "Yes, you sent the food. Yes, you sent a signal for help." "I did. I do not know if anyone heard it, but I sent it." Cyrillith placed her hand over her chest in a gesture that Joel did not recognize. "Among my people," she said, "when a stranger protects the children of another family without being asked and without expectation of return, it is the highest honor our culture knows. You have earned what we call a life debt of flame. It means my family's fire belongs to you for as long as our line continues." Joel had absolutely no idea how to respond to that. He said, "You are welcome." Cyrillith almost smiled. The Drailkin around them began to murmur and shift, and what had been suspicion slowly transformed into something else, as the story of what Joel had done spread through the hangar in whispered Drailkin that Joel could not understand, but could feel in the way the crowd changed around him. They made space for him. They brought him water from the supplies he had unlocked. An elderly Drailkin female wrapped a thermal blanket around his shoulders because humans ran cold compared to them. Drailkin, and the hangar was still not warm enough. Ayari appointed herself his personal guardian and sat next to him with her small chest puffed out and her good wings spread slightly in a protective posture that was clearly instinctive. "I will watch over you," she informed him gravely, "because you have no wings and no fire, and you are very small." "I appreciate that," Joel said. Meanwhile, far from Verith's station, something was happening in the dark spaces between stars. Captain Dahlia Voss had spent 14 years commanding the Resolute Ember, a frigate that had been decommissioned twice and rebuilt 3 times, and held together with what Voss privately described as stubbornness and prayer. When she played Joel's distress signal for her crew, the silence on the bridge lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then her first officer said, "How fast can we get there?" And her navigator was already plotting the course. She rebroadcast Joel's message on every human communication channel she could reach, civilian and military and commercial and private, with a simple addition of her own. "This is Captain Voss of the Resolute Ember. We are responding to this signal. Drailkin families are being forcibly relocated by Council forces. Children are injured. One of ours is already on station. Who else is coming?" The responses started trickling in within the hour. A merchant captain named Wu changed course from a cargo run that would cost him his delivery bonus. A mining crew on an asteroid rig voted unanimously to take their ship and go. A retired naval officer named Esperanza, who was running a cargo hauler with her wife, heard the signal and turned around without even discussing it, because her wife was already pulling up the navigation charts. A medical frigate diverted from its scheduled route, because the chief surgeon said she did not become a doctor to ignore injured children, regardless of species. The message kept spreading. It jumped from ship to ship, and station to station, and colony to colony, and as it traveled, it evolved the way human messages always do, stripped down to its emotional core and amplified by the fury of ordinary people who were not willing to look away. Dragon people on Vayrith, kids are hurt, council does not care, one of ours is already there, who is coming? 12 ships responded in the first 6 hours, 30 by the end of the first day, 60 by the second day, and more were still answering. Back on Vayrith Station, Joel did not know any of this. He only knew that he was trapped in a cargo bay with 4,000 Draelkin who were running out of time. So he did what he knew how to do. He organized. He taught the Draelkin how to insulate sleeping areas with cargo wrapping, and how to create a water rationing schedule, and how to set up a triage rotation for the injured. He could not fix Iari's wing properly without medical supplies, but he fashioned a better splint from a cargo strap and padding, and the little girl flexed it experimentally, and declared it acceptable. An ancient Draelkin elder, with clouded eyes and scales that had faded to silver, gripped Joel's arm one evening as he passed through the hangar. "In 10,000 years, the elder said, in a voice like wind through old stones, no species has stood beside us unbidden. Why do your people do this?" Joel thought about it. He thought about Brannick's Reach, and his mother, who had once driven 4 hours through a storm to bring medicine to a neighbor she did not even like. He thought about human history, which was full of terrible things, but also full of people who ran toward burning buildings instead of away from them. "Honestly," Joel said, "I think we just get really angry when things are not fair." The elder held his arm for a long moment, then released it. "Perhaps," the old Draelkin said quietly, "the galaxy has underestimated your kind." Joel shrugged. "Would not be the first time," he said. The Vethran transport ships arrived on the morning of the third day. 3 massive gray vessels slid into docking position around Vayrith Station, like coffins settling into graves. And inside the cargo hangar, the Draelkin watched through the viewports and knew what was coming. Sub-Prefect Chillick entered the hangar, flanked by 24 armed soldiers, and announced in a flat clicking voice that the relocation would begin immediately. Families would be loaded in groups of 200 and transported to Marin's Drift, where temporary habitat modules would be provided. He did not mention that the temporary habitat modules did not exist yet. He did not mention that the atmosphere processors needed to make Marin's Drift survivable had not been shipped. He did not mention any of this, because it did not matter to the Council whether the Draelkin survived the relocation, only that the relocation happened and the Ethereum core was secured. Began moving through the crowd, separating families into loading groups with the mechanical efficiency of beings who had done this before and would do it again. Cyrillith stood with Iari pressed behind her legs, and Korath's absence like a wound in her chest, and she felt her fire glands heat up for the first time since the crisis began. She was not a warrior. She was a geological surveyor who had spent her career studying mineral formations in asteroid belts. But she was a mother, and her daughter was behind her, and the soldiers were coming, and if this was going to be the end, then she would make it a hot one. Joel stood beside her because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. "If it comes to it," Cyrillith said quietly without looking at him, "take Iari and run, the maintenance corridors, you know them." "I am not leaving you," Joel said. "Joel." I said no. Cyrillith looked at him then, and something passed between them that did not need words in any language. Iari gripped the back of Joel's jumpsuit with one small fist and her mother's tail with the other. And she was not crying, because she had decided somewhere in the last 3 days that she was brave now. The Vethran soldiers reached their section of the hangar. The lead soldier pointed at Cyrillith and Iari and said, "Loading Group 7, move to the east airlock." Joel stepped forward. "She is not going anywhere," he said. The soldier looked down at him with the blank disinterest of a creature addressing an insect. You have no authority here, human. Maybe not, Joel said, but I am standing here, and you will have to move me. The soldier raised his rifle, and then every alarm on Varith Station screamed to life at once. The sound was deafening, a cascading wail of proximity warnings and collision alerts, and threat detection systems all firing simultaneously, and the veteran soldiers froze because their training told them that when every alarm on a space station goes off at the same time, something very, very bad is happening. Sub-Prefect Chilik's communicator erupted with frantic chatter from the operations deck. He listened for 3 seconds, and then his compound eyes went wide in a way that Joel had never seen a veteran's eyes go wide before. "How many?" Chilik said into his communicator. The answer made him go still. Joel did not speak veteran, but Cyrillith did, and she translated in a whisper that shook with something that might have been disbelief or might have been the beginning of hope. 63 ships, she said. 63 human ships just arrived. Through the cargo bay viewport, the dark of space lit up. They came out of faster-than-light travel in a staggered, ragged formation that no military commander would have approved, dropping into real space in bursts of blue-white light, like stars being born. In their ugliness, there were cargo haulers with hull plating that had been patched so many times they looked like quilts. There were mining rigs with industrial cutting lasers that had never been designed as weapons, but could certainly be used as them. There were 2 decommissioned frigates that had no business flying, but were flying anyway. There was a passenger liner whose captain had asked for volunteers among his travelers, and gotten every single one. There was a medical frigate with a red cross painted on its hull that blazed like a wound against the black. And there was one absolute lunatic in a racing yacht who had crossed 4 star systems in 2 days because he had heard the signal, and the signal had made him angry. They were not a fleet, they were a mob, and they were broadcasting on every frequency the galaxy had. Captain Dahlia Voss's voice cut through the chaos with the calm authority of a woman who had been waiting for this moment her entire career. "This is Captain Dahlia Voss of the United Nations ship Resolute Ember, speaking on behalf of the 62 other human vessels currently surrounding your position. We are here to offer humanitarian aid to the Draelkin residents of Varith Station. You are welcome to stay and help. You are welcome to leave. You are not welcome to continue what you are doing." The veteran commander of the orbital fleet responded with outrage, demanding the humans identify themselves and withdraw under threat of military action. Voss responded by forwarding the same demand to the 62 other ships and broadcasting every response. The responses were colorful. The mining crew suggested a location where the veteran commander could store his threats. The retired naval officer quoted the Geneva Convention equivalent from 3 different galactic legal frameworks. The racing yacht pilot simply transmitted a live video feed of himself making a rude gesture with both hands. But beneath the bravado there was something the veteran had not expected. Every single one of those ships was also broadcasting Joel's original distress signal, alongside footage that the medical frigate had captured on approach. Thermal imaging showing 4,000 Draelkin body signatures packed into a freezing cargo hangar, and the small warm dot that was Joel Marin standing among them. The broadcast went everywhere. Council space and human space and neutral space and the deep frontier, where species that had never met a human or a Draelkin watched their screens and saw what was happening at Varith Station. Other minor species saw it too. Species who had been quietly relocated and quietly forgotten, who had lost their homes and their rights and their futures to council edicts and had never had anyone show up for them. Sub-Prefect Chilik tried to call the bluff, transport ships to begin docking procedures, and his soldiers to resume loading the Draelkin. Captain Voss responded by moving the Resolute Ember directly into the docking path of the lead transport ship. A battered frigate with mismatched hull plates and an engine that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs positioned itself between the Draelkin and the ships that had come to take them away. "You will have to go through me," Voss said calmly, "and I should warn you that I am having a very bad week, and I would welcome the distraction." While the standoff played out in orbit, a mining vessel captained by a woman named Chen, who had very creative opinions about docking protocols, managed to attach her ship to a secondary airlock on the far side of the station. The airlock had been sealed, but Chen's crew had cutting torches and a complete lack of respect for council property markers. Within minutes, human volunteers were pouring into Veyrith Station. Came with medical kits and emergency blankets and portable heating units and food supplies and water purifiers. A doctor named Okafor set up a triage station in the cargo hangar and began treating Draelkin injuries with a gentle efficiency that made the wounded weep with relief. An engineer named Petrov took one look at the disabled environmental systems and said words in Russian that Joel did not understand, but deeply appreciated, and within an hour he had the station's heating running at full capacity. A school teacher named Maria from a colony ship had brought actual blankets, soft ones, and she moved through the hangar handing them to families and speaking in a calm, kind voice that transcended the language barrier. She found Iyari and sat down beside her and carefully unwrapped the cargo strap splint and replaced it with a proper medical splint from Dr. Okafor's supplies, patting it gently around the injured wing. Iyari watched this process with intense fascination. "Are you a healer?" she asked Maria. "I am a teacher," Maria said. "What do you teach?" "Children." Iyari considered this. "I am a child," she said. "Then we are already friends," Maria said, and Iyari smiled so wide that her small fangs showed. The Vethrin held their position for 6 more hours, but the Council was watching from across the galaxy, and the Council could count, and the numbers were not in their favor. Not the numbers of ships, because 63 civilian vessels were no match for a Vethrin military fleet in a straight fight. The numbers that mattered were the billions of beings across the galaxy who were now watching the live feeds from Veyrith Station and seeing a galactic superpower trying to force dragon families onto death-trap moons while a crowd of unarmed humans stood in the way. The order came down from Council Command just before evening cycle. "Stand down. Suspend the relocation. Pending review. Withdraw." Sub-Prefect Chilik received the order and sat perfectly still for a long time. Then he stood and walked out of the operations room and ordered his soldiers to return to their ships. He did not look at Joel as he passed through the cargo hangar. Joel did not care. He was sitting on the floor with Iyari on his shoulders, and the little dragon girl was pressing her face against the viewport, watching the human ships hold their formation in the dark, a ragged constellation of lights that burned against the emptiness like a promise. "Joel," Iyari said. "Yeah, kid. Why did so many humans come?" Joel thought about it. "You told your mama I would help," he said. "I just called some friends." Iyari rested her chin on top of Joel's head and watched the lights. "You have very good friends," she said quietly. Joel smiled. "The best," he said. 6 months after the standoff at Veyrith Station, the corridor outside Joel Marin's maintenance workshop had a new sign hanging above it. The sign was painted in bright colors by a Draelkin child who had more enthusiasm than artistic skill, and it read, "Joel who made it warm, Fixing Things Department" in both Trade Common and Draelkin script. Joel had tried to take it down once, because it was misspelled and also slightly crooked. He had been informed by 6 Draelkin children and 1 very stern Draelkin elder that the sign was a sacred honor, and removing it would be a cultural insult of the highest order. The sign stayed. Veyrith Station had changed in the 6 months since the Council's withdrawal, and it had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. What had begun as an emergency rescue had become something entirely new, a joint human-Draelkin settlement, the first formal cooperative colony between the two species in galactic history. Humans had come to Vayrith to save the Draelkin, and then they had simply stayed. Engineers who had arrived to repair the station found work that needed doing and kept doing it. Doctors who had come to treat the wounded established a permanent medical center. Families followed workers, and workers followed opportunities. And within 3 months, Vayrith Station had a human population of nearly 800, living alongside the Draelkin families who had never left. The council had been forced into a compromise that satisfied nobody but prevented further conflict. The Draelkin were granted renewed habitation rights to Vayrith Station, but under the legal fiction that humans were co-signatories to the territorial claim. A diplomatic arrangement that essentially placed the Draelkin under the umbrella of human political protection. The council was furious about this. The council could do nothing about it. Opinion had sided so overwhelmingly with the images of dragon children in a freezing cargo bay and unarmed humans standing between them and forced relocation, that any further action against Vayrith would have been political suicide. Joel had been offered a position as diplomatic liaison to the Joint Settlement Council, a title that came with an office and a salary increase and a dress uniform. He had declined in language that was polite but firm. He was a technician. He fixed things. That was what he was good at, and that was what he wanted to do. And no amount of fancy titles was going to get him out of the maintenance tunnels where he belonged. So he went back to fixing air recyclers and patching coolant leaks. Except now he had a crew of 4 Draelkin apprentices who followed him through the corridors and asked endless questions and called him Joel, because that was how his name sounded in Draelkin mouths, and he had stopped correcting them. Cyrillith had become the de facto leader of the Draelkin community on Vayrith, not because she had sought the position, but because she was the one who had stood at the center of the crisis and come through it with her family and her dignity intact. She spent her days in meetings with human administrators and Draelkin elders, navigating the 1,000 small conflicts and compromises that came with 2 very different species learning to share a home. She and Joel had developed a friendship that was quiet and deep in the way that relationships forged in fire tend to be. They did not talk about the 3 days in the cargo hangar very often. They did not need to. Some things live in the space between words and do not require speaking to be understood. It was on a Tuesday by the human calendar when the docking alert sounded for an unscheduled arrival, and Cyrillith went to the main airlock, expecting a supply delivery, and found her mate standing on the other side of the door. Korath was thinner than she remembered. His scales had lost some of their luster, and there was a new scar running along the left side of his jaw, and he stood in the airlock with the uncertain posture of someone who was not entirely sure he was awake. Cyrillith made a sound that was not a word in any language. It was the sound of a heart that had been holding itself together with willpower and responsibility, suddenly allowed to break open with relief, and she crossed the airlock in 2 strides and wrapped her wings around him and held on as if the universe might try to take him away again. Iyari arrived approximately 4 seconds later, having apparently developed the ability to sense her father's presence through solid metal walls, and she launched herself at Korath's legs with enough force to stagger him, and began talking at a speed that made coherent sentences impossible. "Papa, you are here, and I have so much to tell you, and my wing is better. See, I can move it now, and I have a human. His name is Joel, and he made it warm when it was cold, and he fixed everything, and you have to meet him, Papa. He is very small, but very good." Korath looked down at his daughter, and then at Cyrillith, and his eyes were full of 100 questions, but the answers could wait, because his family was alive and whole, and holding on to him. Joel found out about Korath's return 20 minutes later, when Iari dragged him out of a maintenance shaft by his ankle and hauled him to the family's quarters, with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone her size. Korath stood when Joel entered. He was tall, even for a Draelkin, with deep emerald scales and wings that nearly touched the walls on either side. And he looked at Joel with an expression that Joel could not read. "You are the human," Korath said. "I am a human," Joel said, because specificity seemed important. "There are a few of us around." "You are the human," Korath said. "Who protected my family when I could not?" Joel shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I just fixed the heating," he said. Korath crossed the room in 2 steps, and Joel had a brief moment of uncertainty about whether he was about to be thanked or eaten. And then Korath placed both hands on Joel's shoulders and pressed his forehead against Joel's forehead, in a gesture that made Cyrillith draw a sharp breath. "I invoke the right of eternal flame kinship," Korath said, in a voice that resonated in his chest like a deep bell. "From this day, you are of my line. Your name will be spoken with our names. Your children will be kin to our children, and when the last star dies, the fire of our family will remember that you stood when no one else would." Joel stood very still, with a 7-foot dragon pressing his forehead against him, and had absolutely no framework for processing what was happening. He patted Korath gently on the arm. "Thank you," he said. "Very nice." Up-P. Cyrillith put her face in her hands. Iari beamed. Captain Dahlia Voss visited the station a week later on what she called a routine patrol, and what everyone else recognized as a desire to see what her intervention had helped build. She walked through the corridors with Joel and watched human engineers working alongside Draelkin craftspeople to rebuild the residential ring. And she saw Draelkin children chasing human children through the open spaces of the station atrium. And she saw the medical center where Dr. Okafor was training Draelkin healers in human surgical techniques, while they taught her the Draelkin art of flame therapy for deep tissue injuries. Up-P. "You know your distress signal has become something of a legend," Voss told Joel, as they stood on an observation deck, watching the stars. "I have heard," Joel said. "They are teaching it in schools on Earth, Brannock's Reach, New Geneva, half the colony worlds, the full recording. Voice and everything." Joel winced. "My voice sounds terrible on recordings." "The line about the wrench," Voss said. "I am one man with a wrench. I need more wrenches. That has become a thing. People use it. When something is wrong and someone needs to stand up, they say they are picking up a wrench." Joel looked out at the stars and did not say anything for a while. "I did not mean for it to become a thing," he said finally. "I just needed help." "That is exactly why it became a thing," Voss said. Below them in the atrium, a small dragon girl with a freshly healed wing took a running start and launched herself into the air. Iari flew. It was not graceful. She wobbled and dipped, and her left wing still did not have the full range of motion that her right one did, and she overcorrected on her first turn and nearly crashed into a support pillar. But she flew. She swooped in a wide circle around the atrium, while Draelkin and humans below stopped what they were doing to watch. And then she spotted Joel on the observation deck and dove toward him with the reckless confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of falling. She hit him at roughly chest height and wrapped her arms and wings around him in a hug that drove the air from his lungs. "I flew," she said into his jumpsuit. "I saw," Joel wheezed. "I flew and my wing works, and I am never walking anywhere again." "That seems impractical." "I do not care." Joel held the little dragon girl who had pointed at him across a freezing cargo bay 3 days into the worst moment of her people's history, and told her crying mother that the human would help. And he thought that if he never fixed another thing in his life, this would have been enough. 200 years later, a Draelkin historian named Verith the Yari Korathline stood before a packed lecture hall at the Galactic University of Shared Histories. Delivered the keynote address at the annual Remembrance of Varith. The Draelkin were no longer a minor species. In the 2 centuries since the Varith crisis, they had risen to become one of the most influential civilizations in the galaxy. Fierce and proud and technologically advanced, with a fleet that made the Council think very carefully before issuing any more relocation orders. And at the center of their rise, woven into every treaty and every alliance and every achievement, was their bond with humanity. A bond that had not begun with politics or trade or mutual strategic interest, but with a maintenance technician who had rerouted the heating because children were cold. Varith the Yari Koroth line, named for the little girl who had started it all, dimmed the lights in the lecture hall, and spoke. Our oldest songs now carry a verse that was never part of our tradition. It tells of a night when our fires nearly went out forever. Mothers wept in the dark of a cold steel cage, and the galaxy looked away. And a little girl looked across that darkness, saw a creature with no wings and no flame, and no reason to care, and believed he would help simply because he was there. She was right, and we have never forgotten. The lecture hall erupted in a silence that was more powerful than any applause, the kind of silence that falls when an entire room is holding its breath, because the truth of what they have just heard is too large for noise. In the historian's private study, mounted in a glass case of honor beside ancient Draelkin relics and royal flame crystals worth more than most planets, there sat a battered grease-stained human wrench. The plaque beneath it was simple. It read, "The first wrench from the hand of Joel Marin, who made it warm." And beside the case, almost unnoticed, in its small wooden frame, hung a child's drawing of a tall figure with flat teeth and no wings, standing next to a much smaller figure with enormous wings and fire coming out of her mouth. Underneath it, in shaky letters that had faded but never disappeared, were 2 words, "My human."